One of England's most infamous queens is Mary I. She is known more commonly as Bloody Mary, and her nickname suggests that she has gone down in history as a bloodthirsty and brutal ruler. However, today we're going to look at a series of religious persecutions that gave birth to this reputation for the once Queen of England. Today we look at the Marian Persecutions as they were known, the series of executions and ill treatments of Protestants at the hands of Mary I. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Marian Persecutions are rather different to any other episodes of persecution that took place in England's history, as they weren't really linked to political power or solidifying the monarchy's power. Instead, it was all about religion and instilling the Queen's religion, Catholicism, back into the minds of the people. In just 5 years, around 280 people under Mary's reign were executed. Mary was England's first ever queen, and it's for these executions, with many of them being burnings, to which her legacy is best remembered. She is also known for trying extremely hard to reverse the English Reformation, which had started during her father's reign, due to the Pope refusing to grant him a divorce from Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. With regards to Mary, she attempted strongly to restore Catholicism across the nation, but initially she proclaimed that she would not force any of her subjects to follow her religion. This quickly changed, as in September 1553, a number of leading Protestant churchmen and bishops were thrown into prison. Mary quickly worked to abolish her half-brother Edward VI's religious laws, and she restored much of the old legislation on how to govern churches. Along with this, the persecution came to leading Protestants, and this began in January 1555, following Mary returning England to Catholicism. The persecutions that took place were not popular, and some believe that the punishments were inspired by Mary's husband, Philip of Spain. The persecutions didn't take place before Mary and Philip's marriage, so it's considered that the Spanish influence on the royal family could have sparked this persecution to begin. At the time, many Protestants were fleeing England for their safety, and there were many sects in society who believed that Protestants were heretics and should be punished. The idea of heresy had been around for centuries, with the standard punishment being the total destruction of the heretic's corpse to stop their body parts being used for relics. This is why Mary I burned a huge number at the stake, to prevent relics appearing from these people, and also to make a huge statement to the public. The Marian Persecutions, as mentioned, was the name of the series of executions and ill treatments of Protestants in England. What we're going to do now is look at a couple of these to highlight the sheer brutality of them. The Stratford martyrs were a group of 11 men and 2 women who were all burned at the stake together for their religious beliefs on the 27th of June 1556. All of these had refused to recant to the previous faith, and all remained silent whilst under trial for heresy. Every single one of them was condemned to death and were brought to Stratford for their execution following their imprisonment. The martyrs were then asked to recant again, but they refused again, and because of this their executions took place. A crowd of around 20,000 people were there to witness the events, and it was said that 11 men were tied to 3 stakes, and the 2 women were loose in the middle of the fire without any stake. They then all burned in one huge fire at the same time. This account shows a complete horror of the Marian Persecutions, with 13 people being burned for heresy in one go, in front of a huge crowd. In Canterbury, over a series of years during Mary I's reign, a number of people were also burned. In July 1555, John Bland, John Frankish, Nicholas Shetterden and Humphrey Middleton were all burned together, and then a month later a further 6 men were burned for their beliefs. Another 8 people that year would be burned as part of the persecutions, with over the next few years the trend continuing. In Wisbech, a number of executions took place, in particular with 2 men who were accused of not believing that the body and blood of Christ were present in the bread and wine of the sacrament of Mass. For this they were also burned at the stake in front of the cathedral. Between the years 1555 and 1557 in Lewes, there were a group of 17 Protestants burned at the stake. These were all linked to religion, and at one point on the 22nd of June 1557, on the orders of the Bishop of London, 10 people were burned together on one bonfire. Even in Guernsey on the Channel Islands, burnings would take place. In 1556, 3 women were also burned at the stake for their Protestant beliefs. All 3 of the women were burned on the same fire at the same time, and it was planned that they would have been strangled before they were thrown onto the fire. What made this burning in particular shocking was the fact that one of the women was believed to be heavily pregnant when she was burned alive. There's also people like Joan Waste who were persecuted. Joan was a blind woman who was burned to death in Derby. It wasn't just higher up members of the church or bishops who were sought after, it was everyday people. Joan Waste had objected to having church services being read in Latin and was sentenced for buying a New Testament, which she asked her friends to read for her, paying them a penny a time. She also denounced Catholic ideas regarding the bread and wine, and because of this was sent to her execution at the Windmill Pit. Joan was hanged over the fire, and then she fell into the fire when the rope burned, and she must have suffered horrifically. We also have accounts of high-profile Protestants that document brutality on behalf of Mary. One example is the execution of Thomas Cranmer, and in particular the fact that he recanted back to Catholicism a number of times before his execution. Cranmer had become incredibly influential during the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI, and helped to reform the church greatly, but when Mary I came onto the throne, he was in a huge amount of trouble. He was arrested and sentenced to death for heresy, but when he acknowledged Catholicism and returned to the faith, this was still not good enough for Mary. This sort of behaviour usually would have spared Cranmer, and should have, as in Mary's eyes she could have been seen as being guilty of burning a Catholic, but she pressed on with Cranmer's execution, regardless of the fact that he had recanted. One particular reason in which we view Mary I in this way is the fact that John Foxe's book, The Book of Martyrs, documents the brutal persecutions that took place in such distinct detail. For example, with the Guernsey executions which were mentioned earlier, Foxe wrote how a baby burst out of the woman's stomach and was then thrown back onto the fire again. Through his book we learn about a great deal about the fear that gripped part of the nation, but we also have to take it with a pinch of salt. From John Foxe's book we also have these gripping illustrations that depict the brutal horrors of the Marian executions that show Protestant figures being licked and burned by flames. It wasn't just Mary who was a villain in this activity. One particular figure was Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London, also known himself as Bloody Bonner. He had been reinstated in his role by Mary, and he particularly had a brutal opinion of Protestants. Within his diocese, shockingly around 1/3 of all those burned at the stake occurred within his area. He must have known about all of these arrests, and would have taken part in much of the interrogations and the sentencing. In particular, during one interrogation he questioned a man called Tomkins, who refused to recant, and then Bonner himself held Tomkins's hand over a candle until his skin began to blister and burn. Inside the Book of Martyrs, Bonner is seen as a power-hungry despot who punishes heretics, whipping and beating them, but is also described as a cannibal who feasts on the blood of his victims, with him sparing none of them. Around 50 of these burnings took place at Smithfield, and it was said that whenever they took place, the air was so thick with the smell of burning flesh that people could not even go outside. Even up until the Queen's death, people were being burned at Smithfield, with one final execution being stopped when a messenger carried a message saying that Mary had passed away. For this, the Protestants were saved by the fact that all death penalties needed to be signed by the monarch herself, and because Mary couldn't do this, the execution was then cancelled. So it was for these brutal executions and the Marian Persecutions that Mary I gained her nickname Bloody Mary. What is interesting though is the fact that many more people were executed and persecuted under the reign of her father, yet his reputation, although seen as a brutal leader, he isn't specifically referred to in the canon of history as Bloody Henry. The fear that it must have struck into the population though, seeing people in the community being barbarically burned to death, must have been enough to convince many to revert back to their religious views. Mary I sure made a public statement, and as much as the deaths were for punishment, you can't help but think that they also carried an important propaganda message to bring the country back into religious line. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.